At 1:23 in the morning on April 26, 1986, the control room at Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant Unit 4 was filled with the low hum of machinery and the dull exhaustion of men who had been awake for far too long. The night shift had already stretched on longer than planned, and the safety test they were supposed to complete had gone off schedule hours earlier. Tempers were short, concentration was fading, and yet, nothing about the scene suggested that history was about to change forever. Then the first explosion hit. It wasn't the kind of blast people imagine when they think of disasters. There was no blinding flash, no towering fireball, no instant realization that something catastrophic had just happened. Instead, it felt more like a deep oodah, a heavy thump that rattled the walls and vibrated through the floor beneath their boots. Lights flickered, panels shook, a few gauges wobbled wildly before settling back into place. For a moment, no one spoke. Then came the second explosion. This one was unmistakable. Stronger, sharper, powerful enough to tear through the reactor building itself. The sound echoed through the plant, followed by a strange, unnatural silence. The kind of silence that comes not from calm, but from shock. Inside the control room, alarms erupted all at once. Red lights flooded the panels. Warning tones overlapped into an overwhelming mechanical scream. Operators began shouting readings to one another, trying to make sense of what they were seeing, but nothing lined up. Water pressure was collapsing. Steam output was erratic. Power levels made no sense at all. And yet, the central indicator, the one that mattered most, still claimed the reactor was intact. For several long seconds, no one knew what to say. The men in that room had spent their careers believing in the stability of the RBMK reactor. They had been trained that it was virtually impossible for it to explode. Accidents, yes. Equipment failures, certainly. But a total core breach? That was something that happened in movies, not in real life, not in the Soviet nuclear program. Anatoly Dyatlov, the deputy chief engineer overseeing the test, was the first to break the silence. His voice cut through the noise, sharp and impatient. He demanded reports. He demanded explanations. And when operators began suggesting that something had gone catastrophically wrong, he shut them down immediately. The reactor was intact, he insisted. The instruments must be malfunctioning. Panic had no place in the control room, but something was already wrong in a way none of them could explain. The air felt strange, thick, heavy. Several men complained of a bitter, metallic taste in their mouths. Others rubbed their eyes, which suddenly burned as if filled with sand. One operator leaned over his panel, dizzy, struggling to focus on the numbers in front of him. No one yet understood what those sensations meant, but they were the first signs of something far worse than a mechanical failure. Radiation. Still convinced the situation could be managed, Dyatlov ordered a visual inspection of the reactor hall. Someone needed to confirm the condition of the core. Someone needed to prove that the reactor was still there. 2 men volunteered. They weren't given protective suits. They weren't given radiation meters. They weren't even warned of danger. They were simply told to go look and report back. As they approached the reactor building, the heat became unbearable. The air shimmered in ways that defied explanation. When they finally reached the edge of the reactor hall, they froze in place. The roof was gone. Where a massive concrete lid once sealed the reactor, there was now nothing but open night sky. Jagged debris littered the ground. Chunks of graphite, the very heart of the reactor, glowed faintly as they burned. A dull blue light hovered above the ruins, an eerie shimmer caused by ionized air. It was beautiful in a horrifying way. The reactor core had been torn apart. It wasn't damaged. It wasn't cracked. It was gone. One of the men would later say it looked like staring directly into the mouth of hell. They turned back immediately, their legs shaking beneath them. By the time they reached the control room, their faces had turned pale, their movements sluggish. One of them struggled to speak. When he finally did, his voice barely rose above a whisper. "The reactor. It's not there." The words hung in the air, unreal and impossible. Dyatlov refused to accept them. He accused the men of lying, of exaggerating, of panicking. He insisted the reactor could not have exploded, because it was not physically possible. He demanded they go back and look again. Others were sent in their place. One by one, they returned in worse condition than the last. Some were vomiting. Some complained their skin felt like it was burning from the inside. Others could barely stand. Still, the control room clung to denial, because accepting the truth meant admitting that something had happened that no one had ever prepared for. What none of them realized was that the instruments they relied on were incapable of telling the truth. The radiation meters in the control room were designed with limits far below what now surrounded them. When radiation exceeded those limits, the needles simply stopped moving. The readings didn't climb higher, they didn't flash warnings, they just sat at their maximum values, giving the illusion that the situation was serious but manageable. In reality, radiation levels near the core were tens of thousands of times higher than lethal dose. By the time the men understood what was happening, it was already far too late. Operators began collapsing at their stations. Some vomited violently. Others complained of unbearable headaches and sudden weakness. Their skin reddened as though sunburned, even though they had never left the building. A few lost consciousness entirely. Only then did the truth become undeniable. The reactor had exploded. The core was open to the atmosphere, and nothing on Earth could undo what had already occurred. Still, they stayed. They followed orders. They tried to pump water into a reactor that no longer existed. They attempted to stabilize readings that had no meaning anymore. They believed, or perhaps needed to believe, that their actions still mattered. No one told them they were dying. No one told them to leave. And even if they had been told, many of them would have stayed anyway. By morning, helicopters circled overhead, dumping sand, lead, and boron into the open wound of Reactor 4. Firefighters battled invisible radiation as flames licked the edges of the destroyed building. Soviet officials scrambled to contain information that was already leaking beyond their borders. But inside the control room, the damage had been done. Within days, many of the men who worked that shift were dead. Others would follow in the weeks that came after. Their bodies failed slowly, systematically, in ways medicine could barely understand at the time. All because of a moment. A moment when alarms went off and no one knew why. A moment when the instruments lied. A moment when trained professionals refused to believe what their own eyes were telling them. Today, the control room still exists. The panels remain in place, the buttons untouched, the chairs pushed back as if their occupants simply stepped away for a moment and never returned. It stands as a silent monument to human certainty, and to the terrifying truth that sometimes the most dangerous disasters are the ones no one believes are possible until they are already unfolding. Because the real horror of Chernobyl wasn't the explosion. It was the moment the people in charge realized they no longer had control.